At 10:15 p.m. on the 28th of November 1942, the Cocoanut Grove nightclub in Boston, Massachusetts, was packed beyond its legal capacity. It was a Saturday night during the Thanksgiving holiday weekend. Inside, approximately 1,000 people were crowded into a space designed to hold no more than 620. The club was known for its tropical decor, its celebrity clientele, and its reputation as one of the most popular entertainment venues in the city. That night, the crowd included college students home for the holiday, servicemen on leave, couples on dates, and families celebrating. Everything seemed normal. The bar was busy. The dance floor was full. The lounge was alive with conversation and laughter. At 10:20 p.m., a 16-year-old busboy named Stanley Tomaszewski was working in the Melody Lounge, a basement bar located beneath the main floor. The lounge was dimly lit, as was the fashion for nightclubs of the era. A single light bulb hung above the bar, but it had been removed by a patron who wanted a more subdued atmosphere. The room was too dark for the waitstaff to see clearly. Tomaszewski was asked to fix the light. What happened next would be reconstructed with great difficulty by investigators, fire officials, and survivors. At approximately 10:22 p.m., Tomaszewski lit a match to see in the darkness. He was standing near a decorative palm tree made of paper and cloth. The artificial palm had been placed against the ceiling, and it was frayed from earlier adjustments. The match flame touched the fronds. The fire spread instantly along the surface of the decor. It moved up the wall and across the ceiling. Witnesses later described the flame as moving faster than anyone could react. It was not a fire that grew. It was a fire that exploded. At 10:23 p.m., the fire reached the ceiling of the Melody Lounge. The ceiling was covered with flammable acoustic tiles made of cellulose fiberboard. These tiles had been installed to dampen sound, but they were not treated with fire retardant. Once ignited, they burned with a ferocity that stunned even experienced firefighters who later examined the scene. Within seconds, the entire ceiling of the Melody Lounge was ablaze. The flames traveled up the stairwell leading to the main floor, pulling fresh oxygen behind them. Fire was no longer contained in the basement. It was moving upward through the entire building. At 10:24 p.m., the main floor of the Cocoanut Grove caught fire. The club's interior design included large quantities of flammable materials, rayon draperies, leatherette upholstery, and artificial palm trees made of oil-soaked cloth. These materials had been chosen for their appearance, not their fire resistance. When the flames reached the main floor, they swept across the room in a matter of seconds. Survivors later described the fire as a wave, a wall of heat that moved through the building like a physical force. People who were standing near the exits had no time to move. People who were seated at tables had no time to stand. The fire did not announce itself. It simply arrived. At 10:25 p.m., the lights went out. The electrical system failed as the fire consumed the wiring. The club became dark except for the glow of the flames themselves. Screaming began. Panic spread through the crowd. People rushed toward the exits, but many of those exits were not accessible. The main entrance on Piedmont Street was a single revolving door. The club had installed it as a grand entryway, but it was not designed to handle an emergency evacuation. People pressed against the glass. The door jammed. A secondary door had been bolted shut by club management to prevent patrons from leaving without paying their tabs. Another door was locked from the outside. A fire escape existed, but it was blocked by stored furniture and supplies. The exits that remained open were too narrow and too few to handle the crowd. What happened at the revolving door became one of the defining images of the disaster. People pushed forward from behind, driven by the heat and the smoke. The revolving door could only move in one direction as long as people pushed. But when the mechanism became blocked by the sheer number of bodies pressing against it, the door stopped entirely. People trapped inside the revolving door could not move forward or backward. The fire reached them. Their bodies were found later, still pressed against the glass, still standing upright, packed together so tightly that the door could not be forced open from either side. At 10:27 p.m., the first fire alarm was received. But the Boston Fire Department had not been called by anyone inside the club. The alarm came from a passerby on the street who saw flames through a window. The fire department responded within minutes. When the first engine arrived at 10:30 p.m., the entire building was already engulfed. Firefighters saw people jumping from second-story windows. They saw bodies stacked at the exits. They saw the glass of the revolving door shattered by the pressure of the crowd. They understood immediately that this was not a fire they could contain. It was a fire that had already consumed everything inside. At 10:35 p.m., the fire had burned through the interior structure of the club. The roof began to collapse in sections. Firefighters could not enter the building. They could only direct hoses at the flames from outside and wait. The heat was so intense that it melted the rubber boots of firemen standing 50 feet away. The smoke was thick enough to obscure the entire street. Nearby buildings were evacuated. The entire block was closed off. Ambulances arrived from hospitals across the city. Doctors and nurses gathered at the scene, but they had no patients to treat. Almost no one was being pulled out alive. At 10:45 p.m., the fire began to subside. There was nothing left to burn. The interior of the Cocoanut Grove was a hollow shell. Firefighters entered the building for the first time and found a scene that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Bodies were stacked 5 and 6 deep at the exits. People had died where they stood, crushed by the crowd behind them or overcome by smoke in seconds. The bodies were not burned. Most of them had died from carbon monoxide poisoning or suffocation before the flames ever reached them. The fire had consumed the oxygen in the room and replaced it with toxic smoke. People who took one breath of that smoke lost consciousness within seconds. They never woke up. The final death toll was 492 people. Another 166 were injured. The dead included patrons, employees, musicians, and a bartender who had worked at the club for years. Among the dead were a Boston College football player, a local politician, and a family of 4 who had come to celebrate a birthday. The youngest victim was 4 years old. The oldest was 68. The bodies were taken to a temporary morgue set up on the ice rink of the Boston Garden. Identification was slow. Many families did not know for days whether their loved ones were in the hospital or in the morgue. What happened? The immediate cause of the fire was a single match, but the scale of the disaster was not caused by that match. The scale of the disaster was caused by a series of failures that had been present in the building for years. The Cocoanut Grove had been inspected by the Boston Fire Department in September 1942, just 2 months before the fire. The inspector noted several violations, including blocked exits, insufficient fire extinguishers, and the use of flammable decorations. But the club was given a temporary license to operate while the violations were addressed. The violations were never addressed. The building itself had been constructed in the 1900s as a garage and warehouse. It was converted into a nightclub in 1920. Over the years, the interior was remodeled multiple times without permits. Walls were added, rooms were partitioned, corridors were narrowed. The club had only one main entrance and one secondary entrance, even though the building covered nearly an entire city block. The fire escape had been built to code in 1927, but by 1942 it was blocked by storage. The revolving door had been installed as a decorative feature, not as an emergency exit. The club had no fire alarm system. It had no sprinkler system. It had no emergency lighting. When the lights went out, the building became a maze of dark corridors and locked doors. How could this have happened? That question was asked by investigators, by the families of the victims, and by the public. The answer revealed a pattern of negligence that extended beyond the club itself. The Boston Fire Department had conducted inspections, but the inspections were cursory. The club had been cited for violations, but the citations were not enforced. The club management had been warned by employees about the blocked exits and the flammable decor, but the warnings were ignored. The city had a building code, but the code was not updated to reflect the risks of commercial entertainment venues. The nightclub industry had no standard for fire safety. Each club operated by its own rules, and those rules were whatever the owner decided they were. The investigation also revealed a deeper problem. The Coconut Grove was not the only nightclub in the country with this combination of hazards. It was simply the one where the disaster happened. Similar conditions existed in clubs across the United States. Flammable decorations, overcrowding, locked exits, and inadequate fire suppression were common. The only difference between the Coconut Grove and every other club was that someone struck a match at exactly the wrong moment. The match was random. The conditions were not. The aftermath of the fire changed American building codes permanently. The disaster led directly to the adoption of stricter fire safety regulations for public venues across the country. Revolving doors became illegal as the sole exit in commercial buildings. Fire exits were required to swing outward. Exit doors could no longer be locked from the inside during business hours. Inspections became more frequent and more thorough. The concept of occupancy limits was enforced more strictly. Fire retardant materials became standard for commercial interiors. The lessons of the Coconut Grove fire were written into law, and those laws saved countless lives in the decades that followed. But the question remains, why did it take the deaths of 492 people to change a system that was known to be unsafe? The inspectors knew. The management knew. The employees knew. The patrons did not know, but they would have known if anyone had told them. The information was there. The warnings were there. The failures were known, and nothing changed until the fire. In the weeks after the disaster, the city of Boston held a series of hearings. Club owners testified. Fire officials testified. Building inspectors testified. Each person pointed to someone else. The club owner said the fire department approved his license. The fire department said the club owner promised to fix the violations. The building inspectors said they were understaffed. The presiding judge called the disaster a shameful chapter in the city's history. But no one was ever criminally convicted. The club owner was charged with manslaughter, but the charges were dropped. The families of the victims were left with lawsuits, most of which were settled out of court for modest sums. The Coconut Grove fire remains the deadliest nightclub fire in American history. It also remains one of the most studied disasters in the history of fire science. The behavior of the fire, the toxicity of the smoke, the speed of the flame spread, and the failure of the exits have been analyzed in textbooks and training courses for decades. Firefighters are still taught the lessons of the Coconut Grove. Architects and engineers still reference the changes that followed. The dead are remembered not only as victims but as the reason that fire safety regulations exist at all. What the fire revealed was not new. The hazards were ordinary. The negligence was routine. The disaster was not inevitable, but it was predictable. The match that started the fire could have been struck on any night. The conditions that turned a match into a catastrophe had been in place for years. The story of the Coconut Grove is not about the match. It is about everything that was already wrong before the match was lit. The investigation into the Coconut Grove fire was one of the most thorough of its time. Within hours of the flames dying down, teams from the Boston Fire Department, the Massachusetts State Police, and the National Fire Protection Association began the work of reconstructing what had happened. They measured the building. They mapped the exits. They interviewed survivors who had managed to escape. They examined the bodies for signs of smoke inhalation, burns, and crushing injuries. They traced the path of the fire from the basement lounge all the way up through the main dining room and into the Melody Lounge above. Every detail was recorded. Every assumption was checked. At 11:15 p.m. on November 28, 1942, investigators entered the Coconut Grove for the first time after the fire was extinguished. The building was still warm. The smell of smoke, burnt wood, and melted plastic hung in the air. The interior was unrecognizable. Tables and chairs had been reduced to charcoal. The decorative palm trees that gave the club its name were gone. The ceiling had collapsed in several sections. The floor was covered in debris, including shoes, wallets, purses and jewelry that had fallen from the victims as they fell. The investigators worked by flashlight and portable lamps. The building had no power. What they found in the basement lounge told the first part of the story. The fire had started near a small artificial palm tree in the corner. The tree was made of flammable materials, likely paper or plastic leaves wrapped around a metal frame. It was placed near the edge of the bar, where a busboy had been instructed to dim the lights. The busboy, a young man named Stanley Tomaszewski, had lit a match to see where he was going. The match touched the palm tree. The tree caught fire instantly. The flames spread up the tree and onto the low-hanging cloth ceiling decorations. Within 30 seconds, the entire ceiling of the Melody Lounge was on fire. The fire then moved upward through an open stairway into the main dining room. But the fire did not move slowly. It moved fast, faster than anyone could react. The reason was the materials. The cloth ceiling decorations were made of a lightweight, highly flammable fabric that had been treated with a wax coating to make it look more expensive. When that fabric ignited, the flame front moved across the ceiling at a speed of several feet per second. The heat was intense enough to ignite other materials in the room, including the wooden chairs, the paper lanterns, and the fabric covering the walls. The fire did not crawl. It leaped. It flew. It consumed everything it touched in seconds. At the same time, the fire generated massive amounts of smoke. The smoke was not ordinary smoke. It was a thick, black, toxic cloud consisting of carbon monoxide, hydrogen cyanide, and other combustion byproducts. These gases are deadly at low concentrations. When inhaled, they bind to hemoglobin in the blood, preventing oxygen from reaching the brain and organs. A person who breathes this smoke loses consciousness within 2 or 3 breaths. They do not feel pain. They do not panic. They simply stop breathing. The investigators later calculated that the smoke filled the main dining room within 1 minute of ignition. The patrons in that room had no warning. The band had stopped playing when the fire started, but the sound of the fire was not loud enough to be heard over the music in the crowd. The lights went out when the fire burned through the electrical wiring. In that moment, the room became pitch black. The only light was the glow of the flames above their heads. People did not know where the exits were. They did not know which direction led outside. They moved by instinct, and instinct is not reliable in a fire. The main entrance was a revolving door. It was the only exit that most patrons knew about. When the crowd surged toward that door, the revolving door jammed. The mechanism was not designed for the force of a panicked mob. People pressed against it from both sides. The door would not move. People who had reached the door were crushed between the frame and the turning panels. Others climbed over them or were pushed through by the crowd behind. The door was not wide enough to allow more than one person at a time, but people were trying to pass through in groups. The result was a pile of bodies that blocked the exit completely. The secondary exit was a small door near the kitchen. Led to an alley that connected to Piedmont Street, but that door was not marked. The hallway leading to it was narrow and dark. Many patrons never found it. Those who did found that the door opened inward, not outward. In a crowd, an inward swinging door becomes a trap. People pushed from behind, but the door could not open because the people at the front were pressed against it. The door was also locked from the inside. The management had locked the door to prevent people from sneaking in without paying. The key had been removed. The door was impossible to open. The fire escape was located at the rear of the building, but the fire escape had been blocked by storage. Boxes, barrels, and furniture had been piled on the balcony and in the stairwell. The fire escape was never used. No one could access it. The windows of the main dining room were made of thick glass block. They were not designed to be opened. They could not be broken easily. People inside the club could see the street through those windows. They could see the flashing lights of the fire trucks arriving, but they could not get out. The windows were decorative, not functional. By the time the first fire engine arrived, the building was fully involved. The fire had already consumed the interior. The flames were visible from the roof. The firefighters did not know that the building was packed with people. They did not know that hundreds were still inside. They entered the building through the same door that the patrons had tried to use, but they could not get past the pile of bodies that was blocking the entrance. They had to go around the building and break through the walls from the side. The first firefighter to enter the main dining room later described what he saw as a layer of bodies. The bodies were stacked 3 and 4 high. The people at the bottom had been crushed to death. The people at the top had died from smoke inhalation. In some places, the bodies were still standing, held upright by the pressure of the crowd. The firefighter said he had never seen anything like it. He said he hoped he never would again. The medical response was massive. Hospitals across Boston declared a state of emergency. Doctors and nurses were called in from their homes. Operating rooms were prepared. Blood banks were opened, but the number of survivors was small. Of the 492 dead, only 166 were injured enough to require hospitalization. The rest were dead on arrival. The morgue at the Boston Garden was quickly overwhelmed. Bodies were laid out on the ice rink, covered with sheets. Families walked through the rows looking for loved ones. The identification process took days. One of the victims was a young woman named Barbara, who had come to the Cocoanut Grove with her fiancé, a sailor on leave. They had been dancing in the main dining room when the fire started. Her fiancé pushed her toward the exit, but the crowd separated them. She was found later that night in the pile near the revolving door. He was found near the kitchen door. They were both dead. Another victim was a bartender named John, who had worked at the club for 12 years. He knew the layout of the building better than anyone. He was found in the basement lounge, not far from where the fire started. He had probably tried to put out the fire with an extinguisher, but the extinguisher was empty. The fire department had inspected that extinguisher 2 months earlier and noted it was not working. The citation was not enforced. The investigation also looked at the role of the busboy Stanley Tomaszewski. He was questioned for hours. He was not a suspect, he was a witness. He had struck the match, but he had no intention of starting a fire. The match was a normal, everyday action. He had lit matches to find his way in dark rooms many times before. The difference this time was the material he touched. The investigators concluded that the fire was an accident. No one was charged with arson. No one was charged with manslaughter. The legal system had no way to hold anyone accountable for the conditions that made the accident deadly. In the months and years after the fire, the changes began. The Boston Building Code was rewritten. The Massachusetts Code was rewritten. The National Fire Protection Association updated its Life Safety Code, which became the standard for commercial buildings across the country. Revolving doors were required to be flanked by outward swinging doors in public venues. Fire exits were required to be clearly marked and never locked. Fire alarms and sprinklers became mandatory in nightclubs and theaters. Inspectors were given more authority and more staff. The fire that killed 492 people led to regulations that have saved tens of thousands of lives since. But the regulations did not come easily. There was resistance from business owners who argued that the changes were too expensive. There was resistance from politicians who did not want to impose burdens on local industries. The families of the victims had to testify at hearings. They had to describe what they had lost. They had to describe the bodies they had identified. Their testimony was what finally pushed the laws through, not the technical reports, not the expert analysis, the words of the families. Today, the site of the Cocoanut Grove is a parking lot. There is no monument, there is no plaque. The address is 17 Piedmont Street, but the building is gone. The only reminder is a small memorial in a nearby park, dedicated to the victims. Every year on November 28th, a small ceremony is held. Survivors, descendants of the victims, and firefighters attend. They light candles. They read the names. The ceremony is short and quiet. The Cocoanut Grove fire remains a lesson in how ordinary failures can produce extraordinary tragedy. Match was ordinary. The crowd was ordinary. The building was ordinary. The negligence was ordinary. The only extraordinary thing was the result. 492 people died because a busboy struck a match near a flammable palm tree in a club with locked exits, blocked fire escapes, no sprinklers, and no alarms. The match was the trigger. The conditions were the cause, and those conditions were not unique to the Cocoanut Grove. They were present in thousands of venues across the country. They still are. The question that lingers is not whether such a disaster could happen again. It is whether we are willing to learn the same lesson twice. At 7:10 p.m. on the evening of November 29, 1942, the Boston Fire Department Chief of Detectives arrived at the morgue set up in the Boston Garden. He had been called to oversee the identification process. The ice rink had been covered with tarps, and bodies were laid out in rows. The chief later recalled that the smell of smoke and burned fabric was so strong it clung to his coat for days. He walked the rows with a clipboard, matching names to tags. The crowd of family members outside the garden had grown to over 1,000 people. They were held behind ropes, waiting for news. Some had been waiting since midnight. No one had been told that the identification would take more than a week. The medical examiner's office had to process 492 bodies. Most had died from carbon monoxide poisoning or smoke inhalation. The flames had moved so fast that many victims never had time to take a single breath of fresh air. The carbon monoxide levels in their blood were so high that the coroner later said they would have lost consciousness within seconds of the fire reaching them. That was a cold comfort to the families, but it explained why so few had made it to the exits. The busboy, Stanley Tomaszewski, was questioned again on the morning of November 30th. He repeated his account. He had lit a match to see the light bulb, the palm tree caught fire. He tried to put it out with his hands. The flames spread too fast. The investigators believed him. The fire had been ruled accidental within 72 hours, but the public needed someone to blame. Rumors spread that the fire had been started by a faulty electrical wire or by a discarded cigarette. Some speculated that the club had been torched for insurance money. None of those theories held up. The match was the trigger. The palm tree was the fuel. The lack of exits was the reason so many died. The legal proceedings began in early December 1940. The Suffolk County District Attorney convened a grand jury. The owners of the Cocoanut Grove, Barnett Welansky and his brother James Welansky, were called to testify. Barnett Welansky was the principal owner. He had been in the hospital recovering from a heart attack on the night of the fire. He was not present at the club, but he was responsible for the building. The grand jury indicted him on 19 counts of manslaughter. The trial started in January 1943. The prosecution argued that Welansky knew the club was overcrowded, that the exits were blocked, that the fire escape was not usable, and that the building had no sprinkler system. They presented evidence that Welansky had personally ordered the locking of the kitchen door. A former employee testified that Welansky had said he wanted to prevent customers from leaving without paying. The defense argued that Welansky had delegated safety to his managers, that he was unaware of the specific conditions, and that the fire was an unforeseeable accident. The jury did not accept that. After a trial that lasted 3 weeks, Welansky was found guilty on all 19 counts. He was sentenced to 12 to 15 years in state prison. But Welansky served only 4 years. He was paroled in 1946 on grounds of ill health. He died in 1949. No one else was ever charged. The city of Boston faced a wave of civil lawsuits. Over 130 lawsuits were filed against the club, the owners, the city, and the fire department. The cases were settled out of court over the next several years. The total compensation paid to families was estimated at roughly $5 million, which in 1942 was a substantial sum. But no amount of money could restore what was lost. In the immediate aftermath, the Boston Fire Department conducted a review of all nightclubs and theaters in the city. They found that 27 of the 35 venues inspected had serious safety violations: locked exits, blocked fire escapes, missing extinguishers, overcrowding. The same conditions that had killed nearly 500 people were present in almost every entertainment venue in Boston. The inspectors ordered immediate corrections. The corrections were made, reluctantly, under threat of closure. The changes spread beyond Boston. In 1943, the National Fire Protection Association published its first comprehensive life safety code. The code required that all public assembly buildings have at least 2 exits, that exits be clearly marked, that doors swing outward, that fire alarms be installed, and that sprinklers be required in certain occupancies. The code was not mandatory by itself, but states and cities began adopting it as law. New York City updated its building code in 1944. Chicago followed in 1945. By 1950, most major American cities had adopted some version of the life safety code. The fire also changed the way fire departments responded to large-scale incidents. Prior to Cocoanut Grove, most fire departments did not have formal protocols for mass casualty events. They responded to building fires and car accidents, but not to disasters that involved hundreds of injured and dead. After the fire, Boston established a centralized communications system for coordinating multiple hospitals. That system became a model for emergency management across the country. The concept of triage, sorting patients by severity, was refined during the response. The word triage had been used in military medicine, but it was not commonly applied to civilian disasters before 1940. In 1943, the federal government created the Office of Civil Defense, which later evolved into the Federal Emergency Management Agency. The Cocoanut Grove fire was one of the disasters that prompted the need for a national approach to disaster preparedness. The fire had shown that local resources, no matter how well organized, could be overwhelmed. The need for federal support, for mutual aid agreements, and for standardized training became clear. But not all lessons were learned. In 1944, a fire at the Ringling Bros. And Barnum and Bailey Circus in Hartford, Connecticut killed 168 people. The circus tent had been waterproofed with paraffin wax and gasoline. A small fire started, spread rapidly, and the exits were blocked. The parallels to Cocoanut Grove were obvious. In 1946, a fire at the Weinkauf Hotel in Atlanta killed 119 people. The hotel had no sprinklers, no fire escapes, and doors that opened inward. The pattern repeated. In 1977, a fire at the Beverly Hills Supper Club in Southgate, Kentucky, killed 165 people. The club was overcrowded. Exits were blocked. The fire started in a maintenance area and spread through combustible ceiling tiles. The building had no sprinklers. The owners had ignored fire safety recommendations. 3 years later, in 1980, a fire at the MGM Grand Hotel in Las Vegas killed 85 people. The hotel had no sprinklers in the casino area. Smoke spread through the HVAC system. The fire was one of the deadliest in Nevada history. In 2003, the Station nightclub fire in West Warwick, Rhode Island killed 100 people. The club had been using pyrotechnics that ignited soundproofing foam on the walls. The foam burned quickly and produced toxic smoke. Exits were blocked. The club was overcrowded. The owners had been warned multiple times by fire inspectors, but had not made changes. The fire became a textbook case of how little had changed since 1940. The Station nightclub fire led to another wave of code updates, tougher enforcement, and criminal charges against the owners. The owners were convicted of involuntary manslaughter. The parallels to the Cocoanut Grove fire were striking. In both cases, the ignition source was small. In both cases, the fuel was flammable and non-fire resistant. In both cases, exits were inadequate. In both cases, the owners had put profit over safety. In both cases, the public was shocked that such a disaster could happen again after all the lessons had supposedly been learned. The Cocoanut Grove fire also left a mark on medicine. The victims who survived suffered severe burns. The treatment of burn injuries in 1942 was primitive by modern standards. There were no specialized burn units. There was no standard protocol for fluid resuscitation. The doctors at Boston City Hospital and Massachusetts General Hospital had to improvise. They used saline drips, morphine, and sterile dressings. They operated on patients in regular operating rooms. The survival rate for severe burns was low. Many survivors lived with scarring, disfigurement, and chronic pain for the rest of their lives. The fire also led to advances in the treatment of smoke inhalation. The high carbon monoxide levels in the victims forced doctors to study the effects of asphyxiation in enclosed spaces. They published papers on the relationship between fire size, ventilation, and toxic gas production. Those papers became foundational texts in the field of fire science. In the decades since, the Cocoanut Grove fire has been studied by architects, engineers, lawyers, historians, and emergency planners. It is cited in textbooks on building codes, on crowd behavior, on disaster management. The disaster is used as a case study in how small failures can compound into catastrophe, but it is also used as a cautionary tale about the limits of regulation. The question that lingers is not whether such a disaster could happen again. It is whether we are willing to learn the same lesson twice. In 2023, a fire at a nightclub in North Macedonia killed 59 people. The club had no sprinklers. The fire started from pyrotechnics. The exits were blocked. In 2022, a fire at a nightclub in Indonesia killed 19 people. The club had no emergency exits. The owners had locked the doors to prevent people from leaving without paying. In 2021, a fire at a nightclub in India killed 11 people. The building had no fire alarm. The club was overcrowded. The pattern continues. The details change. The country changes. The year changes, but the underlying conditions remain the same. A crowded room, flammable materials, blocked exits, no sprinklers, no alarms, a small ignition source, a moment of carelessness, and then the fire moves faster than anyone can run. At the time of the Cocoanut Grove fire, there were an estimated 25,000 nightclubs and theaters in the United States. After the fire, only a fraction of them were inspected. The ones that were inspected were often given a grace period to comply. Many never complied. Fire itself was not the event that forced change. The event that forced change was the public outcry, the lawsuits, the press coverage, and the political pressure. But that pressure faded. The laws stayed on the books, but enforcement waned. Today, the National Fire Protection Association estimates that thousands of nightclubs and bars across the United States still have safety violations. The most common violations are blocked exits, missing extinguishers, and overcrowding. Inspectors are understaffed. Inspections are infrequent. Penalties are low. The economic incentive to ignore safety is high. The Cocoanut Grove fire remains a lesson in how ordinary failures can produce extraordinary tragedy. The match was ordinary. The crowd was ordinary. The building was ordinary. The negligence was ordinary. The only extraordinary thing was the result. 492 people died because a busboy struck a match near a flammable palm tree in a club with locked exits, blocked fire escapes, no sprinklers, and no alarms. The match was the trigger. The conditions were the cause, and those conditions were not unique to the Cocoanut Grove. They were present in thousands of venues across the country. They still are. The lesson is not that we need more regulations. The lesson is that we need to enforce the regulations we already have. The lesson is that safety cannot be left to goodwill. The lesson is that every locked door, every blocked exit, every missing extinguisher is a potential death sentence waiting for a match. In Boston, the Cocoanut Grove fire is part of the city's collective memory. The survivors have died, one by one. The last known survivor, a woman named Mary, passed away in 2019 at the age of 99. She had been in the main dining room that night. She escaped through a window that someone had smashed with a chair. She never went to a nightclub again. The parking lot at 17 Piedmont Street remains empty. There is no plaque. There is no monument. The only memorial is a small granite stone in a park a few blocks away. It reads, "In memory of the 492 men, women, and children who died in the Cocoanut Grove fire, November 28, 1942. No further words. Every year on the anniversary, the Boston Fire Department holds a brief ceremony. The chief lays a wreath. The names are read. The crowd is small. The ceremony lasts less than 10 minutes, then it is over. The parking lot remains empty. The lesson remains unspoken. The question remains unanswered. At 10 o'clock on the morning of November 29, 1942, the investigation into the Cocoanut Grove fire began in earnest. The Boston Fire Department, the Boston Police, and the Massachusetts Department of Public Safety convened at the scene. The building was still smoldering. The interior was a charred shell. Investigators walked through the rubble with flashlights, taking notes, collecting evidence, and photographing the remains. They found the locked door on Piedmont Street. They found the blocked fire escape. They found the missing sprinklers. They found the false ceiling of flammable material. They found the bodies stacked where the exits should have been. The evidence was clear. The cause was not in dispute. The question was responsibility. Who owned the Cocoanut Grove? The club was operated by a corporation, the Grove Corporation. The majority owner was a man named Barney Welansky. He was a local businessman with ties to organized crime. He had been convicted of extortion in the One Night with Zeros and had served time in prison. After his release, he became a nightclub owner. He was known for cutting corners. He was known for bribing city inspectors. He was known for running a profitable but dangerous establishment. The fire was not an accident. It was the direct result of his decisions. Welansky was in the club the night of the fire. He survived. He was taken to a hospital with minor injuries. 3 days later, on December 1, 1942, he was arrested. He was charged with manslaughter. The trial began in January 1943. The prosecution argued that Welansky had known the club was unsafe. They pointed to the locked doors, the blocked exits, the lack of sprinklers, the flammable decorations. They argued that he had deliberately ignored fire safety for profit. The defense argued that the fire was an unforeseeable tragedy. They claimed that Welansky had complied with all city ordinances at the time. They argued that the club had passed inspections. The jury did not buy it. On March 13, 1943, Barney Welansky was found guilty of manslaughter. He was sentenced to 12 to 15 years in state prison. The sentence was later reduced. He was paroled after 4 years. He died in 1965. He never expressed public remorse. The trial revealed deeper failures. City inspectors had visited the Cocoanut Grove multiple times. They had noted safety violations. They had not enforced compliance. The city building department, the fire prevention bureau, the licensing board, all had accepted bribes or looked the other way. The corruption was not unique to one club. It was systemic. The city of Boston had a culture of lax enforcement. Fire inspectors were underpaid. The nightclub industry was lucrative. The lines between business and government were blurred. After the fire, a wave of reforms swept through Boston and then the nation. The first reform was the adoption of the National Fire Protection Association's Life Safety Code. The code had existed since 1913, but it was optional. After the Cocoanut Grove fire, states began to adopt it as law. The code required sprinklers in buildings of certain sizes and occupancy levels. It required clear exit paths. It required doors to open outward. It required fire alarms. It required fire-resistant materials in decoration and construction. The second reform was the creation of a unified building code. Before 1942, building codes were local and inconsistent. A building in one city might meet code while the same building in another city would not. After the fire, the state of Massachusetts adopted a statewide building code. Other states followed. The third reform was the creation of professional fire inspection programs. Cities began to hire full-time fire prevention inspectors. They began to conduct regular inspections of nightclubs, theaters, and other public venues. They began to enforce penalties. The fourth reform was the development of modern burn care. The fire had overwhelmed Boston's hospitals. The doctors who treated the victims published their findings. They described the importance of fluid resuscitation, wound care, infection control, and rehabilitation. Their papers influenced the creation of the first burn units in the United States. The first was opened at Massachusetts General Hospital in 1948. Others followed. The treatment of burn injuries became a specialized field of medicine. The fifth reform was the establishment of the National Fire Protection Association's Committee on Fire Prevention. The committee studied the Cocoanut Grove fire in detail. They produced a report that listed every failure: the locked doors, the blocked exits, the flammable decorations, the lack of sprinklers, the lack of alarms, the overcrowding, the poor lighting, the lack of emergency plans. The report became the standard for fire safety in public assembly venues. It was translated into multiple languages. It was used by fire departments around the world. Despite all these reforms, fires continued. The pattern was not broken. The same failures appeared again and again. In 1944, a fire at the Ringling Brothers Circus in Hartford, Connecticut killed 168 people. The tent had been waterproofed with paraffin wax and gasoline. The exits were blocked. The parallels were obvious. In 1946, a fire at the Weinkauf Hotel in Atlanta killed 119 people. The hotel had no sprinklers, no fire escapes, and doors that opened inward. In 1977, a fire at the Beverly Hills Supper Club in Southgate, Kentucky, killed 165 people. The club was overcrowded. Exits were blocked. The building had no sprinklers. In 1980, a fire at the MGM Grand Hotel in Las Vegas killed 85 people. The hotel had no sprinklers in the casino area. Smoke spread through the HVAC system. In 2003, the Station nightclub fire in West Warwick, Rhode Island, killed 100 people. The club had been using pyrotechnics that ignited soundproofing foam on the walls. The foam burned quickly and produced toxic smoke. Exits were blocked. The club was overcrowded. The owners had been warned multiple times but had not made changes. The fire became a textbook case of how little had changed since 1940. And then the fires kept happening. In 2013, a fire at a nightclub in Brazil killed 242 people. The club had no sprinklers. The fire started from a flare. The exits were blocked. In 2016, a fire at a nightclub in Romania killed 64 people. The club had no sprinklers. The fire started from pyrotechnics. The exits were blocked. In 2021, a fire at a nightclub in India killed 11 people. The building had no fire alarm. The club was overcrowded. In 2022, a fire at a nightclub in Indonesia killed 19 people. The club had no emergency exits. The owners had locked the doors to prevent people from leaving without paying. The pattern continues. The details change. The country changes. The year changes, but the underlying conditions remain the same. A crowded room, flammable materials, blocked exits, no sprinklers, no alarms, a small ignition source, a moment of carelessness, and then the fire moves faster than anyone can run. The Cocoanut Grove fire remains a lesson in how ordinary failures can produce extraordinary tragedy. The match was ordinary. The crowd was ordinary. The building was ordinary. The negligence was ordinary. The only extraordinary thing was the result. 492 people died because a busboy struck a match near a flammable palm tree in a club with locked exits, blocked fire escapes, no sprinklers, and no alarms. The match was the trigger. The conditions were the cause, and those conditions were not unique to the Cocoanut Grove. They were present in thousands of venues across the country. They still are. The lesson is not that we need more regulations. The lesson is that we need to enforce the regulations we already have. The lesson is that safety cannot be left to goodwill. The lesson is that every locked door, every blocked exit, every missing extinguisher is a potential death sentence waiting for a match. In Boston, the Cocoanut Grove fire is part of the city's collective memory. The survivors have died, one by one. The last known survivor, a woman named Mary, passed away in 2019 at the age of 99. She had been in the main dining room that night. She escaped through a window that someone had smashed with a chair. She never went to a nightclub again. The parking lot at 17 Piedmont Street remains empty. There is no plaque. There is no monument. The only memorial is a small granite stone in a park a few blocks away. It reads, "In memory of the 492 men, women, and children who died in the Cocoanut Grove fire, November 28, 1942. No further words. Every year on the anniversary, the Boston Fire Department holds a brief ceremony. The chief lays a wreath. The names are read. The crowd is small. The ceremony lasts less than 10 minutes. Then it is over. The parking lot remains empty. The lesson remains unspoken. The question remains unanswered. Why does the pattern continue? Why does a disaster that killed nearly 500 people, that led to sweeping reforms that was studied for decades, continue to repeat itself? The answer is not simple. It is not about a lack of knowledge. It is about a lack of will. Fire codes exist. Inspections exist. Penalties exist. But enforcement is inconsistent. Budgets are cut. Politicians prioritize business interests over safety. Owners prioritize profit over people. The public forgets. The memory fades. The next generation does not know the history. And then a match is struck in a crowded room with no sprinklers and blocked exits, and the fire takes everything. The Cocoanut Grove fire is not a story from the past. It is a story that is happening now in different cities, in different countries, in different venues. The names change. The dates change. The numbers change. But the story does not change. It is the story of people who trusted that the building they entered was safe. It is the story of people who paid for a night out and ended up paying with their lives. It is the story of owners who knew the risks and did nothing. It is the story of inspectors who could have stopped it and did not. It is the story of a system that was designed to protect people but failed them. The question remains unanswered, but the answer is simple. The answer is that we have to choose to learn. We have to choose to remember. We have to choose to enforce. We have to choose to care. Because if we do not, the match will be struck again, and again, and again, until the lesson finally sinks in, or until we decide that the lesson does not matter. The choice is ours. The fire will not wait. In the days after the fire, the work of identification began. The city of Boston set up a temporary morgue in the ice skating rink at the Boston Arena. The building was large enough to hold the hundreds of bodies. The smell of smoke and burned flesh hung in the air. Families gathered outside, waiting for news. They carried photographs, descriptions, and personal items. They hoped for a miracle. Most were disappointed. On November 29th, the medical examiner's office started processing the dead. The bodies were arranged in rows. Each one was tagged with a number. Photographs were taken. Fingerprints were lifted. Dental records were collected. Personal effects were cataloged. The process was slow. Many bodies were too badly burned to be identified by sight. Some had no identifiable features left. The examiners turned to clothing, jewelry, and scars. A silver ring, a monogrammed watch, a tattoo on an arm. These small details became the only way to give a name to the anonymous dead. One woman, a mother of two, was identified by a locket she always wore. Inside was a picture of her children. The locket had melted, but the picture was still visible. Her family recognized it. Another victim, a young man, was identified by a distinctive belt buckle he had bought the week before. His parents had given it to him for his birthday. He had been in the Melody Lounge when the fire started. He never made it to the exit. The identification process took weeks. Of the 492 dead, 469 were identified. 23 bodies were never claimed. They were buried in a common grave in a cemetery outside Boston. A small stone marker was placed over the plot. No names were listed. The families of those missing continued to search. Some never accepted the loss. On December 2nd, the first funeral was held. It was for a young woman named Evelyn, aged 19. She had been a secretary. She had gone to the Cocoanut Grove with her boyfriend. He had also died. The funeral was small. The priest spoke about the tragedy. The coffin was closed. The family wept. Over the following weeks, hundreds of funerals took place across Boston. The city was in mourning. Flags were lowered, stores closed. The governor declared a day of remembrance. The legal process began in January 1943. The owner of the Cocoanut Grove, Barney Welansky, was charged with manslaughter, criminal negligence, and violating fire safety laws. The trial lasted 4 weeks. The prosecution presented evidence that Welansky had ordered the main exit doors locked to prevent people from leaving without paying. They showed that he had allowed the club to be overcrowded. They proved that he had installed flammable decorations and blocked the fire escapes. Witnesses testified that he had been warned about the dangers but did nothing. Welansky's defense argued that he was not present on the night of the fire. His lawyers claimed that other employees were responsible for locking the doors. They tried to shift blame to the busboy who had struck the match. They argued that the fire was an accident, not a crime. The jury did not agree. On March 19, 1943, Welansky was found guilty on all charges. He was sentenced to 12 to 15 years in state prison. The judge in his sentencing said that Welansky had shown a callous disregard for human life. He said that the fire was not a mere accident but a foreseeable result of negligence. He said that the deaths were preventable. The courtroom was silent. Welansky showed no emotion. He was taken away in handcuffs. Welansky served 3 years and 9 months. In 1946, he was granted parole due to declining health. He had been diagnosed with a heart condition. He was released in December 1946. He returned to his home in Boston. He expressed no remorse. He said little about the fire. He died in 1947 at the age of 58. The cause of death was a heart attack. The families of the victims received no apology. The civil lawsuits followed. More than 100 families filed claims against the Cocoanut Grove Corporation, the building owners, and the city of Boston. The lawsuits alleged negligence, wrongful death, and failure to enforce safety codes. The cases were consolidated. The trial lasted months. In 1946, a jury awarded damages to some families. The amounts were small. The average settlement was a few $1,000s. Many families received nothing. The legal costs ate up the rest. The Cocoanut Grove Corporation declared bankruptcy. There was no money left. The fire's impact on the law was not limited to the courtroom. It changed the way that legislators thought about fire safety. In 1943, the Massachusetts state legislature passed a series of new laws. They required all public places to have clearly marked exits. They mandated that doors open outward. They required exit signs to be illuminated at all times. They set maximum occupancy limits. They gave fire departments the power to shut down any building that violated the code. These laws became a model for other states. On the national level, the fire accelerated the adoption of the Life Safety Code. The National Fire Protection Association had been working on a comprehensive set of standards since the 1900s. The Cocoanut Grove fire provided the evidence needed to push them through. The 1943 edition of the Life Safety Code included specific requirements for nightclubs and restaurants. It required panic hardware on exit doors. It required emergency lighting. It required fire alarm systems in large venues. It became the foundation of modern fire safety regulation. The fire also spurred research into the behavior of smoke and flames. Scientists at the National Bureau of Standards conducted experiments to understand how the fire had spread so quickly. They built scale models of the Cocoanut Grove. They tested different materials. They found that the artificial palm trees, made of dried plant fibers coated in wax, did indeed burn extremely fast. They found that the ceiling decorations, made of crepe paper and cloth, contributed to the rapid spread. They found that the lack of ventilation allowed smoke to accumulate. They concluded that the fire had reached flashover within minutes. Flashover is the point when everything in a room ignites simultaneously. It is the deadliest phase of a fire. The Cocoanut Grove reached flashover in less than 5 minutes. The research led to new building codes that restricted the use of flammable materials in public spaces. It led to requirements for automatic sprinkler systems in high-risk areas. It led to better smoke control systems. It saved lives, yet the pattern continued. In 1944, the Ringling Brothers Circus fire killed 168 people. In 1946, the Weinkauf Hotel fire killed 119. In 1977, the Beverly Hills Supper Club fire killed 165. In 2003, the Station nightclub fire killed 100. In 2013, the Kiss nightclub fire in Brazil killed 242. In 2016, the Cocoanut nightclub fire in Romania killed 64. Each fire had its own story. Each fire had its own failures. Each fire had its own locked doors, blocked exits, flammable materials, and missing sprinklers. Each fire killed people who should have survived. The Cocoanut Grove fire is not the worst fire in American history. The deadliest was the Peshtigo Fire of 1871, which killed over 2,000 people. The Iroquois Theater Fire of 1903 killed 600. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire of 1911 killed 146. But the Cocoanut Grove Fire remains the standard by which all other nightclub fires are measured. It changed the laws, it changed the medicine. It changed the way we think about fire, but it did not change human nature. People still lock exits. People still block fire escapes. People still use flammable decorations. People still ignore warnings. The memory fades. The lessons are learned and then forgotten. The cycle repeats. Today, the site of the Cocoanut Grove is a parking lot. The building that stood there was demolished in 1943. The lot is paved and lined with cars. There is no sign. There is no marker. The only official memorial is a small granite stone in a park at the corner of Chaumont Avenue and Piedmont Street. It was placed there in 1990. It bears the names of the dead. It stands in a quiet corner surrounded by trees. Most people walk past without noticing. On the anniversary, a few people gather. Firefighters, survivors, family members, they lay wreaths. They read the names. The ceremony lasts. Then they leave. The parking lot returns to its purpose. Cars come and go. The dead are remembered only in the quiet moments. The Cocoanut Grove fire is a story of what happens when ordinary negligence meets a small spark. It is a story of what happens when safety is treated as an afterthought. It is a story that has been told many times, but it has not been learned. The fire will not wait. It never did. The fire also left a permanent mark on medicine. On the night of the disaster, hospitals across Boston were overwhelmed. The emergency rooms at Boston City Hospital, Massachusetts General Hospital, and others received hundreds of burned and injured victims in a matter of minutes. They had no protocols. They had no burn units. They had no experience with such massive numbers. They improvised. The doctors at Massachusetts General Hospital treated more than 130 victims. Many had severe inhalation burns, not just surface wounds. The physicians quickly realized that the lungs, not the skin, were the primary cause of death. They began using a technique called tracheotomy, cutting a hole in the throat to bypass the damaged airway. They also administered antibiotics, a relatively new innovation, to fight infection. The mortality rate was still high, but the experience became a turning point in burn medicine. In the months after the fire, a surgeon named Dr. Oliver Cope founded the first specialized burn unit in the United States at Massachusetts General Hospital. The unit was designed to treat patients with severe burns in an environment that reduced infection. It used isolation techniques, strict sterile protocols, and new wound dressings. The unit treated many of the Cocoanut Grove survivors. It also became a model for burn centers around the world. Every modern burn unit owes a debt to that disaster. The fire also changed how the military approached burn injuries. During World War II, combat burns were common. The protocols developed in Boston were adapted for field hospitals. The use of early excision of dead tissue, aggressive fluid resuscitation, and specialized nursing care became standard. The Cocoanut Grove fire, a civilian tragedy, helped save soldiers in the Pacific and Europe. Yet the fire's longest shadow is not in hospitals or codes. It is in the silence of the survivors. Many who escaped the club carried invisible scars, nightmares, guilt, a fear of crowds and enclosed spaces. They rarely spoke about what they saw. The firefighters who pulled bodies from the pile had similar trauma. One firefighter, interviewed years after, described the sound of the dead. "It was the quietest place I have ever been." That quiet never left him. Today, the parking lot at the corner of Shawmut Avenue and Piedmont Street holds no trace of the club. But the lessons remain embedded in the buildings around us. Every exit sign, every outward swinging door, every illuminated emergency light, they are all answers to a question asked in the dark on the night of November 28, 1942. The question was, how could this happen? The answer then and now is that it could happen again. The fire will not wait. It never did.